First, the smell of water, ash, and cold stone. In the darkness of the monastery laundry room, wet canvases stick to your hands, and the bell emits a high-pitched, prolonged sound, as if counting other people's actions. Outside, people walk slowly between the benches and gates, each under supervision. Some cross themselves, some turn away, some stare at the ground. Here, purity is not just about laundry. Here, it is about the body, thoughts, and destiny. And purity has overseers who are allowed to ask questions, take notes, and make decisions. Hello to everyone listening. I'm glad you're with me. Right where you are watching this video from, and what you find most unexpected, and what you find most honest in stories like this. I hope you enjoy listening. In the damp steam and whispering under the arches, a woman named Agatha moves about. She washes the cloths of Lady Edel, a widow from the House of Minor Knights, and secretly sews a tiny thread of a different color into the hem. She tells herself that she is doing this so as not to mix up other people's things, but she knows that it is important for her to remember which cloth recently covered the body. The day before, the archdeacon announced that a new decree had been issued in the city. Lay people are required to go to confession once a month, and the guards must check compliance using lists that are passed on to the abbot. He said that failure to comply would result in a simple penance and a fine in silver. The word fine spread through the market like smoke from a forge. It doesn't hurt the eyes, but it penetrates through clothing. Everyone whose life hung by a thin thread between the church and the judge in the castle began to count the days until the next bell tolled. Agatha lives by a warm wall where they heat the bread oven. She is a laundress, but as a child, she helped in the scriptorium. She brought water, watched the scribes write letters, and memorized the subtle signs in the margins: hooks, palms, lilies. Since then, her hands have understood what a trace is. She doesn't say she can read canonical handwriting because it makes people laugh, but she looks at the world as if there are references, hints, prohibitions, and permissions in the margins of its pages. Mrs. Edel came to the laundry early that day. She ordered clean sheets to be brought to her door before sunset, and said that a new tax collector from the Lord was coming, and everything had to look perfect, like on a holiday. She said that a new secular decree had been announced in the square that morning. It was forbidden to spend the night in someone else's house without registering with the gatekeeper. It was forbidden to wear clothes not appropriate to one's social class. And it was forbidden to buy spices without the consent of the market elder. She added that supervision was now security, and if anyone thought otherwise, they should not complain when they came for them. In the evening, returning with her basket to her wall, Agatha noticed a thin man in a scribe's cloak near the gate. He was holding a scroll with a wax seal. He told the guard that he was carrying a letter to the abbot. But the abbot was no longer in the office, and asked to have it accepted against receipt. The guard shrugged and told him to come back in the morning. The stranger lowered his eyes, walked over to a column, and stood there for a long time, as if choosing where to stand so as not to obstruct the air. Then he approached Agatha and asked her to give the scroll to a monk she knew, Ignatius, if she saw him. He said that the letter was dangerous because it concerned a marriage that had to be annulled, and that if the letter were lost, someone would be forever bound to a stranger's house and a stranger's will. He gave his name as John and said that he was a simple man, but he had seen the records in the monastery's brachiography, where degrees of kinship were recorded, and realized that in one union people were closer than was customary. Agatha took the bundle and saw a lily on the seal, similar to the one she used to draw in the margins as a child for fun. At night, she heard footsteps at Lady Edel's door and the rattle of a wrought iron latch. She knew that the castle's steward sometimes came there. He loved other people's rooms and other people's secrets. The next morning, he ordered her to bring a clean tablecloth and shook a small thread of a different color out of his sleeve. He said that the laundress was careless and ordered the guard to write her name in the list of offenders. Agatha did not argue. She remained silent and remembered that it was not only her eyes that had seen the thread from the edge of the cloth. With the list of offenders, the world changed direction, as if someone had placed a new bookmark between the pages. Confessions now became like a fair. People walked humbly, but each with an inner reckoning. A queue formed at the confessional. The archdeacon said that the bishop's decree was clear and supported by the secular authorities. Swearing in the market, a fine. Drunkenness on a day of service, a fine. Wedding night before the appointed witness, suspension of marital rights. He added that blood ties would be questioned separately because the purity of homes and families depended on it. He said that every confession was good for the soul and good for the city. While people were moving their lips, Agatha noticed a woman in a townswoman's cloak and a peasant man standing next to her at the door. The woman stood confidently, the man like a man who was used to keeping silent. They were Martha and Peter. Martha was Mrs. Edel's maid, whom she tolerated for her dexterous hands. Peter was the adopted son of a blacksmith from the outskirts. They asked the abbot for his blessing to marry and had already paid for the registration. They had witnesses, but they did not have money for a big feast. They hoped that everything would be quiet and quick. Agatha knew Martha. She sometimes left a piece of bread at the laundry as a token of gratitude. Peter knew how to repair buckets and hammers without looking at them. This is how someone who always listens to what he is told and divides the world into necessary and superfluous repairs things. That evening, fog covered the courtyard. Agatha went to see the monk Ignatius. He was short, thin, and always busy arguing with books rather than people. He said it was better not to keep the package because the seal was secular and the smell of wax was not monastic. He said that the letter was probably about some important union, and if the marriage was canceled, it meant that someone powerful wanted to be free. He added that such matters usually reached the councils, where canonists argued at length, but the decision was then announced briefly, like a verdict. Agatha felt that the letter contained two worlds at once, the one where her acquaintances lived, and the one where castles protected their walls from rumors. The next day, a barrel of letters that the guards had intercepted from merchants was brought to the square. The abbot announced that all correspondence would now be checked, because letters could conceal deception and harm purity. He said that marriage was not a private matter, but a matter of order for the family and the city, and that unsealed notes would be burned. The people gasped. Agatha hid the bundle under her laundry, but felt Mrs. Eddle's eyes on her. She knew that the laundress sometimes had things that did not belong to her. The lady had her own business. Her nephew needed a profitable union, and she was seeking permission for him to marry the daughter of the merchant Hugo, a man with money and shelter for the poor, who liked to say that charity was also an exchange. Merchant Hugo rarely listened to unnecessary words, but he loved to give simple advice, like coins. He kept a barn by the river, where it smelled of salt and boxes. He loved order and clean books. When a new decree came out about checking clothes according to social class, he suggested that the townspeople buy simple cloth from him so as not to take any risks. He promised to give credit to those who honestly said they couldn't pay right away. He said that the church loves cleanliness and that prayer cloth is better than old velvet. People nodded. Agatha noticed that he had a ring on his finger with a letter similar to the seal on the scroll, and she remembered this calmly, without speculation. Martha and Peter came to the abbot again. They were told that the blessing had been delayed. They needed to confirm that they were not related within 4 degrees. Martha turned pale. She had been raised in a house where maids disappeared without explanation, and she knew what the word verification meant. Peter lowered his head. He had spent his whole life listening to people older and stronger than him, and he had only one desire, that Martha would not cry. He told Agatha that he would go to the city office and find someone who knew how to look up family trees. He returned in the evening, crumpled like a wet rag. He was told that the records were incomplete because fires and floods had destroyed parts of the books. But if there were any doubts, the marriage would not be allowed. He said that supervision for the sake of purity was now like a thorn. The deeper you go, the more it hurts. Meanwhile, Agatha's bundle had become like a stone. It weighed her down and demanded a decision. At night, strangers began to appear at the gate. They asked the guard if he had seen a letter with a lily on it. They said that the bundle contained an authoritative letter of recommendation, and that anyone who broke the seal without authorization would be brought to justice. Agatha hid the letter behind a saint's icon, where no one would look without reason. She understood that this was no longer just her secret. It was like water under ice, invisible but audible. Soon the abbot announced something new. Every house had to register all its residents with the roadside scribe. Failure to comply would result in a fine, and lying would result in church punishment with public repentance. A table was set up at the gate. From early morning, Mrs. Edel, the merchant Hugo, the tailor, the butcher, and the apprentices began to gather there. Agatha stood at the end of the line. The scribe John, the one with the letter, sat at the table and listened attentively. He wrote down names and, as if casually, asked questions about parents and godparents. He said it was necessary to ensure that future marriages were pure. He said it calmly, without threats. His voice sounded like a straight line in the fields. Agatha understood. The letter she was holding was connected to this line. By evening, a small crowd had gathered outside Mrs. Edel's house. Someone whispered that her nephew could not marry. Allegedly, his future bride, the daughter of the merchant Hugo, was his second cousin, through an old connection between their families. The rumor spread instantly. Mrs. Edel ordered the guards to clear the passage. She said that the canonists would decide everything, and added that those who whispered by the fence would stand in the square, without shoes, as punishment. People scattered, leaving footprints on the ground. Agatha noticed that an old man with a cane, who often took bread at the shelter, was standing at Merchant Hugo's door in the morning. He looked at Mrs. Edel's window and nodded quietly. It seemed as if he had remembered something. It became clear that a check of family relationships had begun in the city. This was not a personal matter, but a general arrangement. The abbot ordered the old baptism and funeral books to be brought in. He said that the monk Ignatius would verify the authenticity of the records. He added that anyone who tried to change names would be barred from the sacraments, and the secular authorities would add penalties. Everything looked legal and even familiar, but there was tension in the air. From this point on, everything began to resemble a domestic thriller. One night, a boy from the orphanage came to Agatha's house and handed her a bundle. Inside was a piece of expensive fabric and a short, unsigned note. The note said that if the bundle with the lily was returned to the merchant Hugo's barn before dawn, Agatha would be removed from the list of offenders and given a job in a warm room. It also said that checking the degrees of kinship was unnecessary, as everything could be resolved with a monetary ransom. It was a straightforward exchange. Agatha felt that the warm air of the oven could also be a trap. She did not respond. She went to the monk Ignatius and said that she was being summoned to the barn by night. Ignatius said that it seemed like a test of weakness. He pointed to a tiny mark on the wax seal and said that the seal had been cast from a mold that had once belonged to a castle, and had then ended up with a merchant as payment for a debt. He said that the connection was not direct, but it was tangible. Agatha realized that the letter with the lily was not about the merchant's mercy, but about his debts and old obligations. In the morning, when the bell rang for confession, a woman with a crack in her voice came to the monastery. It was the old woman from the orphanage, the one who looked after the children and remembered who came when. She told the abbot that she had a copy of an old godparent certificate where Martha's name was listed alongside the name of Mrs. Edel's nephew's mother. She said that in those days, godparents were often chosen from among the neighbors, and this created a bond that is now considered a spiritual kinship. She did not know the details, but she knew the procedure. If the spiritual kinship was deemed sufficient, the union needed permission. The abbot thanked her and told Ignatius to write it down. Agatha, standing nearby, realized that this was a thread. She remembered the thread at the edge of the cloth. It was all one, inseparable. Meanwhile, Peter did what no one expected of him. He went to the merchant Hugo and said that he had heard that the inspection could be canceled for a fee. He said that all he had from the blacksmith's house were his hands, but he knew how to repair and count. He offered to sort out the counting of bags and loading at the pier for free, because he had noticed how the loaders were lying about the numbers, and because of this, the merchant was losing money. Hugo smiled at first, but then let him look at the books, wanting to test his self-confidence. Peter quickly figured out the order and found the shortage. He did it simply, without any tricks. He showed where the bags were leaving without being recorded. The merchant lost part of his turnover because of the lazy eyes of the senior loader. It was a hidden talent against status. The craftsman improved the rich man's business in a way that a scribe with a beautiful hand could not. The merchant stopped looking down on Peter. He said that the boy was useful and that he would write to the abbot to make an exception for the couple. Peter refused. He said that exceptions give freedom to one person and secretly harm others. He said he wanted to do things legally. His words sounded as flat as a mark in the margins. When Agatha found out about this, she thought for the first time, the guy everyone calls silent is not silent when it matters. Rumors about the letter with the lily did not subside either. Someone tried to break into the merchant's barn twice at night. Once, the guard scared off a skinny stranger, and the second time they found footprints by the wall. The merchant realized that he was also being targeted. He went to the abbot and said that he preferred the judgment of canon lawyers to dark threats under his windows. The abbot nodded. He said that such cases were taken outside the city and heard at councils. He said that a meeting was expected in the coming weeks to discuss a major alliance, which the city would learn about anyway. He hinted that letters with lilies could not hide the branches of a tree if the roots were known. Agatha couldn't stand it and went to the shelter. She found the old man with the staff. He said that he had once been a scribe for a knight, and that the knight's son was Lady Edel's nephew. He said that he had kept the books for a long time, and had seen how the merchant Hugo lent money to this house in exchange for patronage and the right to keep the seal on important letters. He said that then the knight died, the debts remained, and the seal remained with the merchant, as if someone else's hand were holding yours. Agatha realized that the merchant was not just a benefactor. He owed the past just as much as the poor owed him. She realized that, unexpectedly, he himself could become a benefactor out of necessity. To intervene and change the course with a single decision, so as not to be dragged out of the swamp of old ties. She saw the wheel turning. The decree was read out again in the square. No marriage may be contracted without verification of spiritual and blood kinship to the degree specified by canonists. The crowd began to murmur. Someone asked why such words had not been spoken before. The abbot replied through the town crier, "Because evil has learned to hide in habit." The townspeople accepted this as they accept the cold. It is unpleasant, but understandable. And then something happened that many did not expect. Mrs. Edel was summoned to the monastery office. Merchant Hugo, the abbot, Ignatius, the scribe John, Martha, Peter, and the old man with a staff were already there. The abbot said that they had information about the degree of spiritual kinship between Mrs. Edil's house and the merchant's house. He said that without permission, the union between Mrs. Edil's nephew and the merchant's daughter was impossible. The books confirmed the connection through an old godparent couple. He said that they had to wait for the decision of the Council of Canonists. Mrs. Edil turned pale. She was used to resolving matters with simple threats and gifts. Now she was being asked to wait for the law. The merchant nodded. He said he was tired of nighttime footsteps and whispers. He said he would do what was necessary so that people could see that he was not sweeping dirt under the rug. At night, the threats increased. Someone left a stone instead of bread at Agatha's door. The merchant's most trusted people whispered that he would lose his share in the city council. Some of Mrs. Edil's servants began to look frightened. Martha walked around the house as if on a thin plank over water. Peter repaired locks as if he knew how to repair destinies. He said that he had met a messenger at the pier who had uttered the name Bojansi, and said that people were coming there from all sides because they would be discussing a marriage that could not be left as it was. Peter did not know what that meant, but he remembered the word. Agatha took out the letter with the lily that same day and took it to the monk Ignatius. Ignatius carefully examined not only the seal, but also the shadows around it. He said that the letter was addressed not to the local bishop, but to the canonists, gathering closer to the western lands. He said that the letter requested the study of a union of such a high level that local marriages would then be modeled on it. He added that the mark at the bottom was an indication of the house of rulers whose name was better not to be spoken aloud in the laundry kitchen. He read the title and understood. It was about a marriage that united the most powerful, and which they wanted to unravel because of close kinship. He said it was like untying a knot tied in front of the whole world. He said that if such a knot were untied, local knots would also weaken. The abbot decided to send delegates. He said that Ignatius and the scribe John would go with the letter, because one knew the canonical hand and the other knew how to look at lists without fear. He said that 2 people from the city would go with them as witnesses to how supervision works on the ground. He chose Martha and Peter. He said that it was precisely such people who knew how a house lived when it was ruled by the bell of strangers. Mrs. Edil objected, but she was tired. She felt that the ground beneath her feet had turned from a carpet into a staircase, and she could not stand on it, only go up or down. Merchant Hugo did not object. He said that big decisions must be viewed through the eyes of little people. Otherwise, they will always be about them. The road was long. They walked through villages where lists of those who had confessed hung on the doors, and through towns where clerks explained the new rule in a rehearsed voice. Those who do not appear will pay, and those who pay will appear anyway. They saw women hiding records of their godchildren in chests, and men pursing their lips when they heard the word kinship. They saw priests and elders now walking in pairs, so that the signatures would be more secure. Agatha imagined how the shelter in the city smelled of soup at that time, and her barrels stood empty. She had no regrets. It seemed to her that she was walking along the line of a letter, and every stone on the road was like a dot. Something happened at the roadside inn that no one would have dared to write in a book if there had been no witnesses. A man in a dark cloak burst into the room and tried to snatch the bundle from Ignatius. Peter managed to put his shoulder in the way, and the blow missed. Martha knocked a jug of water onto the floor, and the thief slipped. Ignatius pressed the bundle to his chest like a baby. John ran out into the corridor and called the owner. The thief ran away, leaving a lily-shaped stain on the floor from the wet wax that dripped from his finger. It was a twist in an everyday thriller. A simple inn became the scene of a struggle for a letter, on which the alliances of the strong and the weak depended. Peter, whom many considered quiet, turned out to be the one who defended the canonist's hand, and who, therefore, changed the course of the entire night. The next morning, Ignatius said that it would be recorded in the report. Peter shrugged and began to repair the door latch. They came to where the canonists were gathering. Here they spoke not at length, but clearly. Here they brought books with genealogies and showed marks, like arrows pointing to kinship. Here they judged not souls, but order. Here they did not shame, here they counted. When the priest said that the case of the king and his wife would be considered that day, the hall glowed like a field under the sun. Ignatius and John exchanged glances. They understood that this was the very letter. They passed it on, observing the signs. There, names were spoken that we do not hear in our kitchens, but hear in books. Louis VII, ruler of the Frankish lands, and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. The canonists listened to arguments about the degree of kinship and the fact that the union had not produced a male heir, which strengthened the desire to untie the knot. In the end, after weighing up the arguments and referring to the norms, the council announced the annulment of the marriage on the grounds of blood relationship. This was a real case of annulment of marriage according to the norms of that era, confirmed by canon law, and recorded in such a way that future cities would look to it as an example. The date was announced in writing, as required, so that there would be no confusion that would invalidate it. In March of the year 1152, at the council in Beaugency. The hall fell silent. Some were frightened by the future, while others saw it as an opportunity. On their way back, they saw the words of the decision walking ahead of them. At the inns, people said that if such a knot could be untied, then small knots were not forever. On the bridges, merchants argued about how the new rules would affect their daughters, who were supposed to marry apprentices from neighboring cities. In the villages, women whispered about whether godparenthood could be considered an obstacle if the godparents had long since died. Priests replied that this was to be decided locally, and that confession was mandatory, and those who concealed anything would be punished. Supervision became even tighter, but the fear changed. It was not only about punishment, but also about the possibility of choice. If important people could say no to their union through the law, then ordinary people would also begin to look at their relationships differently. When they entered the city, almost everyone came out to meet them. The herald announced that the marriage of the great house had been dissolved, and that this was an example for all. The abbot thanked Ignatius and John for their service. Merchant Hugo stood in the front row and looked not at them, but at Peter. He realized that the silent man was an underrated hero. Not only did he save the bundle in the night shelter, but he also showed in the barn how to find someone else's lies without shouting. The merchant approached him and said through Ignatius that he wanted to appoint Peter as the loading supervisor and give him a house near the pier. Peter replied that he did not need a house without Martha. The merchant smiled and said that this issue would now be resolved more quickly and honestly. Mrs. Edel invited the abbot to her home. She told him that the public eye had become like a mirror, and she did not want to live under it without peace. She said that she would arrange for her nephew to recognize the impossibility of their union and not look for workarounds. She said that it was easier to breathe in the house when you didn't have to hide your laundry. The abbot nodded. He said that purity was not about stubborn lists, but about order that did not require lies. He said that this required both confession and secular decrees, but without people who made choices. These were dead letters. The next day, Martha and Peter came to the abbot again. Ignatius brought out the books. John asked the old woman from the shelter if she remembered the records. She nodded. The scribe checked that the spiritual kinship between the lady's house and Martha's house did not create an obstacle to Martha's union with Peter, if there were no other degrees of kinship. He said that they were distantly related by blood, and that no obstacles had been found. The necessary words were spoken calmly, without fuss. The abbot announced that the marriage could take place. It was not a favor or a gift. It was a decision based on the same norms that had brought to light other people's letters and big names. Candles were lit in the square. People silently rejoiced in the joy of others as if it were their own. The herald reminded everyone that from now on, all marriages would be checked more carefully, and confession would be necessary not for punishment, but for clarity. He repeated that secular decrees and church lists now converged like two roads at a gate. Someone sighed heavily. Someone felt relieved. Merchant Hugo approached Agatha and said he wanted to give the shelter more grain. He said he no longer wanted to hold anyone to old debts. He said it was better to give away bread than to play a double game. Agatha nodded. She remembered the ring and the bundle. She realized that the merchant had become an unexpected benefactor, not because he was kinder than others, but because he saw where his own trail was leading. She respected that more than the kind words at the market. That same night, the same thin man in a cloak appeared at the gate. This time he did not hide. He told the guard that he had come to ask for forgiveness. He said that he had tried to steal the letter not of his own free will, but on the orders of one of the servants at the castle, who had been promised money. He said he had seen taxes grow out of empty threats. The guard took him to the abbot. The abbot listened and assigned him penance and work at the monastery. He said that stealing a letter was a blow to order, and order was necessary, so that the weak would not fall prey to the strong. The scribe John recorded this incident in the book as evenly as all the others. The date in words, the name, and the punishment. There was no shouting, no ostentatious cruelty. It was a quiet return to the visible path. Agatha suddenly became noticeable during those days, either because she carried water to Ignatius, or because that very bundle had been lying on her table for several nights. She did not talk much about her role. She continued to wash and hem the edges with colored thread, so that she would remember whose cloth was where. She knew that this was her form of record-keeping, her little canonical hand. Mrs. Edel called her one day and said she had heard that the laundress was helping the monastery. She said there was a place in the house hotter than the kitchen where attentive hands were needed. Agatha refused. She said that by the stove and the barrels, she had enough light and control over time. She did not want to become an appendage of the house, which only agreed to the rules for the sake of peace. She wanted to stay where it was not the master who looked down from above, but the bell. Gradually, life changed. Priests began to ask not only about simple mistakes during confession, but also about God-parent relationships. People stopped hiding the names of their godchildren. In the markets, they argued about where the line between supervision and care lay. Some said it was the same thing, that it was about control. Others said it was about clarity and the lesser evil. The abbot repeated that without confession, a person does not know himself, and without a charter, a city does not know the boundaries of its shadow. They listened to him because he did not shout or hide his interest. He went to the funerals of the poor just as he went to the feasts of the rich. One spring, when the river rose, news came to the city. Eleanor of Aquitaine had remarried quickly, without waiting for lengthy discussions with her neighbors. People whispered the name of her new husband, and the air was full of emotion, as if after a storm. Some said with annoyance that important people always get everything done faster. Others said that now both the important and the unimportant had learned that the purity of the marriage bond was tested not only by kitchen gossip, but also by the letter of the law. Someone whispered that there would soon be war in the north. Someone replied that the city was small and had enough of its own stones and barrels. The abbot said that the world had changed and that supervision would no longer go away. He said that supervision always had two faces. One looked at the body as a vessel for rules, the other as a home for peace. He said that we make the choice, not the arches. Martha and Peter lived quietly. Their marriage was not a celebration, but it was strong. Peter became a watchman at the pier, but he did not lose the habit of counting aloud. He said that this way he could hear order and see where the lies were. Martha stopped being afraid of the footsteps in the hallway of her mistress's house. She no longer served there. She sewed in her own home and brought wool to the shelter. She said that people needed not only bread, but also new sleeves to keep them warm. Merchant Hugo visited them sometimes. He brought grain and looked at their little house, checking to see if they needed help. He said he considered his debt partially paid, but the memory of the seal did not fade. Agatha once took an old piece of fabric out of the chest and found a lining with embroidered letters. crooked but recognizable. They were the initials she had seen in the margins of books as a child when she carried water. She realized that everyone in the city carried something from the past that was now becoming visible to everyone. She smiled. She looked up at the bell, and it seemed to her that the sound had become lower and calmer. She remembered how someone had recently said in the square that purity was about fear and punishment. Someone replied that it was about clarity and freedom from the secret hands of others. She thought that maybe it was both, and that the difference lay in who held the lists and who read them. A little time passed, and the old man with the staff, the former scribe, died. He was buried by the monastery wall. The abbot said that such people were the memory of the city, albeit a poor one. John wrote his name and the information he had once reported in the book. The rich and the poor stood side by side at the funeral. Mrs. Edil stood up straight. Merchant Hugo was silent. Peter squeezed Martha's hand. Agatha stood a little apart and thought about the threads. She knew that supervision would not go away. And she knew that now it was not just about fear. It was about the order that people had accepted as their own, because they themselves had walked the road to Beaugency and back through their own yard. From that day on, a new sign was posted on the city gates. It read, in simple words, without embellishment or unnecessary flourishes, "Every marriage requires verification of blood and spiritual kinship. Confession is mandatory for all on a monthly basis. Lying and concealment will be punished by the church and the state. A clean record will be protected." Below it was nailed another. By decision of the council, announced in March of the year 1152, the union of King Louis and Eleanor of Aquitaine is dissolved due to close kinship. This is an example for all cities. People read, traced the letters with their fingers, and nodded. Some were indignant. Some found support in it. But the board hung firmly. Agatha returned to the stove in the evening. She took the dried cloth off the rope and ran her finger along the edge. The sewn thread still stuck out like a tiny antenna. She smiled. She didn't believe in miracles. She believed that any fabric was held together by stitches. She knew that cleanliness under supervision should be not only about guard duty, but also about work. People, confessions, decrees, books. All of these are stitches, and as long as they were strong, the city had a chance not to fall apart at the most crucial moment. She put the cloth in the basket and thought that today would be peaceful, and tomorrow the bell would ring again, high and long, but no longer like a whip, but as a reminder that the road was visible, and that you could walk on it without hiding your gaze. Thus ended the story of how, in one city, cleanliness became not just a requirement from above, but a choice made by people who saw the rules as a fabric that could be sewn without lies, and how the real abolition of the great marriage became the last loop in the pattern, after which the pattern ceased to confuse and began to support.